Today, we're going to be looking at peer community in PCI, leaving publishers out of the peer review process. Please do feel free to say hello in the chat and to introduce yourselves. My name's Jane Saunders. I'm Associate Director for Content and Discovery at University of Leeds Libraries, and I also sponsor the Open Higher Education strand of our FORRT plan. The format for today is that we're delighted to be joined by two speakers, and we would be very pleased if you could keep yourselves on mute whilst our speakers are speaking, but there will be time at the end for a discussion, for any questions that you have. And at that point, please do feel free to pop your hand up and unmute. And please feel free to post comments and questions in the chat. I have a colleague, Tom Freeth, on the call today with me, and Tom and I will be making sure that we pick up comments and questions that are posted in the chat. So I'm delighted that we have our two speakers with us today. We have Professor Chris Chambers, who will be talking about peer community in registered reports. Chris is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Cardiff University, and his primary research focuses on the promotion and effectiveness of open research practices. He has co-founded and contributed to many open research initiatives, including the UK Reproducibility Network, and he's also author of The 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology. And then I'm delighted also to welcome Maddi Pownall, who's Associate Professor of Psychology here at the University of Leeds. And Maddi will be talking about the role of recommender for PCI, peer community in registered reports. And Maddi's new book, Absent Minds, is being published in May. And this focuses on the history of psychology and uncovers the lost legacies of women in the field. So delighted to welcome Chris and Maddi. Just before I hand over to Chris, I would just like to say that University of Leeds Libraries is very proud to support peer community in. 2 years ago, we set up an open access support fund so that we could support initiatives, infrastructures, networks around open access. And so we're delighted that we, as part of that, are supporting peer community in. And peer community in, if I move to the next slide, I don't know if the next slide isn't yet appearing, but I just wanted to say that peer community in offers thematic platforms to review preprints, and it also offers the open access multidisciplinary peer community journal. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris to say a bit more about peer community in, and in particular, registered reports. So I shall now stop sharing.
Thank you, Jane. Right, so let me just share my screen. There we go. Give me a shout if you can't see that. Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me today to speak about PCI registered reports. This is a topic that I care a lot about, and as Jane mentioned, these days, primarily, most of my work is really focused in the meta science space and trying to develop positive interventions that we can use to support all of us in doing more reproducible science and research in other areas. Now, I guess when we're introducing this topic, it's important, I think, to say a little bit about the history of why we're doing any of this stuff. So in the last 15 years, as many of you will know, there's been big discussions in the life and social sciences surrounding reproducibility, the extent to which work that's been done, findings that have been published previously can be successfully repeated. There's been concerns about transparency and openness of research. There's been concerns about different kinds of bias in the research literature, publication bias in which positive results are prioritized over and above negative or null findings, and linked to that reporting bias, where faced with all of the pressures to publish and the pressures to produce positive findings, authors almost routinely in many areas now selectively publish the outcomes of their research that are statistically significant or positive or tell a good story. And of course, this has a lot of negative downstream consequences on the reliability and transparency of our various research fields. And this is how I really became involved in this topic. Registered reports are really an attempt to answer this question. So before we get to PCI registered reports, let me just say a little bit about what registered reports are. So they attempt to sort of solve one of the core causes of irreproducibility, which is publication bias and reporting bias. And the registered reports format does this really simply by taking the regular peer review process that we're all familiar with, and essentially chopping it in half, so that rather than reviewing research after it's been completed and results are known and conclusions are included in a paper, what authors instead do is submit a proposal for their research study before it's undertaken. This undergoes in-depth review by specialists in the area who evaluate, much like they would in a grant application, they evaluate, theory, the strength of the rationale, the methodological rigor and robustness. And based upon this pre-study evaluation, they can eventually recommend in-principle acceptance, in which the journal or the platform that's performing the evaluation guarantees to publish the final outcomes of that study, regardless of how those results turn out. And so in doing so, authors can be assured that the results of their research won't determine the fate of that research in terms of where it's published or how it's published. Now, when the authors have finished doing the research, they come back with a completed stage 2 paper that now includes results and discussion, with the results reported in line with the protocol. And the reviewers then come back and evaluate compliance with protocol and basically whether the conclusions are based on the evidence. They don't re-litigate the study design, the rationale, the theory. That's all been done. Now they're just focusing on the completeness and accuracy of reporting. And the hope is that this kind of split process helps to remove results-based evaluation from the scientific literature. And so when we introduced this back in 2012/2013, it was a very new idea back then. And since then, it's grown to be adopted by several hundred journals now globally, including well-known journals like Nature. And we're building a promising portfolio of early meta-science suggesting that it is working as we would hope. It's popular with early career researchers who are in the coalface really doing research. Any initiative in open science must be popular with the researchers who are doing most of the work. We're finding promising signs that it's reducing bias toward reporting results that confirm predictions. So when authors do a registered report, they're many times more likely to disconfirm their hypotheses. We're also finding that the registered reports that have been published are more computationally reproducible. They tend to be rated higher in quality across many different characteristics than regular articles, and they're cited more or less the same. So far, so good. Registered reports, as originally kind of created within the constructs of journals, are working as intended, but they're still fairly low in uptake and very much dominated by the regular literature. Now, this journal-based registered reports model is promising, but it isn't perfect. There are a number of major limitations to it, which I'll briefly summarize. The first is the stage 1 review time. If I ask, a bunch of 100 researchers why they don't do registered reports, there's a good chance most of them will say, I can't afford to wait for my stage 1 registered report to go through peer review. It takes too long. I'm on a time-limited contract. I've got a time-limited grant. I've got other constraints. Waiting 3 or 4 months to go through that initial review process is too long, and therefore I have to defer to the regular track. Secondly, when you run registered reports to a journal, of course, we're constrained to submitting to one journal at a time, just like with a regular article, which can slow down the research process, particularly if you're submitting your proposal before you've even started the research. A third limitation we've identified is that in many areas of science and other fields in academia, researchers like to propose programs of research where they might have one large-scale plan in which they plan to fork multiple kind of outputs from it, much like a fellowship application or a large-scale grant application. And this kind of programmatic model doesn't really fit very well with the typical registered reports format, which is very serial and linear, that one stage 1 manuscript leads to one stage 2 output. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, and perhaps most fundamentally, when we limit the registered reports initiative to journals, we're ceding control of the peer review process. And by virtue of that, any innovations we might want to make to the peer review process to academic publishers, most of which are commercial, Wiley, Elsevier, Springer Nature, etc., which exist to produce profit at the expense of the labor of the academic community. So can we do better than this? Well, I think we can. I think the solution really requires taking registered reports above and beyond journals. It's quite interesting that to solve all of the problems really that we've found, that the imperfections with registered reports over the last 10 years, all of the answers seem to push us to doing peer review differently for registered reports above and beyond journals, which is why back in 2019, I was very excited to learn about the PCI initiative, the Peer Community Initiative, this free non-commercial platform that evaluates preprints before they go to journals. And I was excited about this because immediately I started to think, what if we were to combine this open, non-commercial platform that's completely separate from publishers with registered reports? So what if we had a peer community in registered reports? And to date, of course, there are lots of, as Jane mentioned, there's quite a lot of PCIs across different areas, different themes. I think there's about 20 now. Each of these evaluate preprints within particular disciplines, but they don't evaluate registered reports. What PCI registered reports does is acts kind of like a column that cuts through all of them, which evaluates registered report preprints across any area of research: STEM, medicine, social sciences, humanities. And once a submission is peer reviewed by PCI registered reports and fully evaluated, goes through revision, just like it would at a journal, managed by an expert recommender, which is our term for editor. And those peer reviews and recommendations are made public. And what happens then is you end up with a kind of journal independent acceptance that this registered report has received in principal acceptance or later stage 2 acceptance. And then the interesting part here, the cool bit, is that authors have the ability to publish their recommended preprint within any traditional journal if they wish. So they don't have to, they can leave it as a reviewed and recommended and positively recommended preprint with a DOI, or they can publish in the peer community journal, which is the Diamond open access journal that PCI supports, or they can publish in any other journal, including a growing list of what we call PCI registered reports friendly journals. So these are journals that have committed to accepting the recommendations of PCI registered reports without further peer review. So these journals have said, we trust your process, we trust your expertise to the extent that we will allow your review process that you managed, your open review process, to replace any review process that we would have undertaken had that registered report been submitted directly to our journal. And there are massive benefits for everyone in doing this. One of them is efficiency. So here's just a list. This list is probably not very readable, but here's just a list of the current PCI friendly journals. And what happens now is that when the authors get a positive recommendation following stage 2 of their registered report, when they have results, they get to choose which journal from this list, if any, gets to publish their stage 2 registered report. So if that journal is eligible, if it meets, if the article meets certain criteria that will get into that journal, then they decide where it gets published. So this turns the tables completely on the academic publishing system, and now journals are competing for recommended preprints. Here's just some examples of some of those journals. And we also have a second fleet of journals, which we call PCI interested journals. So these are journals which don't automatically accept the recommendations of PCI registered reports, but then usually that's because they evaluate registered reports according to slightly different criteria. So we have a series of quite strict and highly specific criteria that we judge and evaluate registered reports according to. Some journals, particularly those that are more prominent, might involve additional criteria. If those criteria vary, then these journals can join our interested list, where instead of automatically endorsing the recommendations, they get added to a kind of priority list. They get to see any embargoed submissions. They get to see the submissions as soon as they get to stage 1 acceptance. And then they can reach out and make offers to authors for further review or for immediate IPA. And they often do that. So for example, PLOS Biology might jump in and say, oh, we really like this recommended stage 1 submission, and we'd like to invite the authors to submit to our journal at stage 2 or even after stage 2. So what you can see here is that we've created a model in which the peer review process exists as a kind of super layer on top of the journals, no longer managing the peer review process through journals, but the same academic community managing that process separately from journals. And this also allows us to create some innovations which can really improve registered reports, which would be very difficult to implement under the restrictions of a publisher. One of these is what we call a programmatic registered report. So this is where you have one stage 1 manuscript that proposes multiple different stage 2 outputs. So within that one plan, there are multiple proposed stage 2 outputs coming from it, which is ideal for researchers who are planning simultaneous studies or very closely sequential studies across an area where the results of one don't necessarily impact the design of the next. So they can lock in all of those designs at once, go through one efficient review process, and then once they get IPA for the set, each of those stage 2s can refer back to that initial IPA. And the second, and perhaps the really, I think, groundbreaking kind of innovation we can do here is called scheduled reviews. So as I mentioned, perhaps the single biggest hurdle for researchers to engage in registered reports is the stage 1 review time. And we found that one way of greatly accelerating this process without putting reviewers under extra pressure or degrading the quality of the review process is simply to parallelize certain parts of the review stages. So with standard review, shown here in panel A, what typically happens is authors prepare a stage 1 manuscript in complete form, like in a full manuscript. This is then submitted. The recommender evaluates it at desk, acquires reviewers. It takes some time to find all those reviewers. It goes under review, and eventually there's an initial stage 1 decision where the recommender issues either a reject, accept, or revise decision. And that time can be quite extensive, and it can be 2-3 months to go through that stage, because all of the different processes have to happen one after the other. So finding reviewers, as anyone knows who's worked within a journal or any kind of review structure, finding reviewers is probably the most time-consuming part of handling any kind of submission. And that's just added on to the time that authors take to write their manuscript. But can we do this more efficiently? We can. So with scheduled review, authors prepare a stage 1 snapshot, which is a 1-page summary of their planned submission that they're going to write. Based on this 1-page kind of pro forma, the recommender acquires reviewers and schedules that review process for a future date. And the recommender is doing this whilst the authors are actually writing the manuscript. And then we ask the reviewers to evaluate the submission within a short time window in the future. So for example, 6 to 8 weeks from now, you're going to receive a manuscript on this topic, and we'd like you to consider reviewing that within this narrow time window. And please only accept the review request if you can do it within this narrow time window in the future. So we're asking the reviewers to kind of plan and ring fence their time in the future. And we found that this can greatly accelerate that initial stage 1 review process, taking it from weeks and months down to even a couple or even 2 or 3 weeks at its fastest. So I don't want to throw too much at you. That's just some of the initial kind of, I think, benefits of doing this platform. And Maddi will also talk about this further. But there's a few additional links here I'd like to just identify. First of all of these slides are available here on my OSF page, so you can access all of them. And I've got some information here for authors, some general information. If you're involved in any kind of journal editing, I've got details on how to become an adopter. And you'll be able to see too, if you go to the website, that we've got quite a broad range of submissions coming in. One of the great things about PCI is that it removes as many barriers as possible for people to submit science and have it peer reviewed. And so we get submissions from all around the world, from the global south, from places that are not typically highly represented with registered reports, and we're getting them across all kinds of interesting topics. So I'll leave those links there. I think I've talked for long enough, and we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a really helpful and insightful overview of how the registered reports works, that process, and also how PCI facilitates that process. Thank you very much. So I'll hand over now to Maddi. Maddi, are you okay to share your slides?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Will someone shout at me if you can't see my slides?
They're there.
good.
They're fine.
Okay, no one's shouting. Okay, thanks, Jane. Thanks, Chris. So, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be having this conversation because I think PCI and I think PCI registered reports is the most innovative, genuinely transformative thing that I have seen in the past few years, which I think is actually changing things and making things better. So how we've kind of accidentally done this is that Chris has kind of talked about the structure, that this is what it is, this is the rationale, this is how it's done. And what I thought I would do is give a bit of a perspective about what this stuff actually looks like and feels like as a researcher engaging in it, and also as someone who's a recommender. So I want to talk about a few things. I'm going to focus less on the kind of scientific research, culture, rationale for why PCI is a good thing and why registered reports are a good thing and why it makes kind of sense to do this stuff. And instead, I'm going to talk quite self-indulgently, actually, if you'll allow me, on why I think as an individual researcher who's engaged with some of these practices, why I think that it has actual benefits for researchers. Because one of the things that I care deeply about in my research, so I'm a meta-scientist and I also care about pedagogy and women and lots of other things, is I think one of the things that I have a big eye to is making sure that whenever we are introducing new open research innovations and whenever we're trying to make things better for scientific integrity or research integrity or culture, that we are not losing sight of what that actually looks like and feels like as a researcher trying to do good stuff. Because I think sometimes in some of the stuff that I've kind of written about and spoken about before, I think sometimes there are asks of researchers that makes their work better and makes their work more credible, which actually makes the experience of being a researcher sometimes more challenging or more time consuming or labor intensive or difficult. And so the reason why I like PCI so much is I think that it's one of those that I've seen or I've experienced genuine benefits in as a researcher. So I've called my bit of the talk 4 reasons why I like peer community in. As Chris was talking, I might even sneak in a 5th because I've thought of some other things in my role of recommender as well. But these are just my experiences. So I wasn't sure how much Chris was going to talk about, but I think we've kind of done this. So peer community in registered reports. I'm going to talk both about the kind of PCI generally. So as Chris mentioned, there are PCI journals that are not registered report journals that are kind of peer community in more from the point of view of researchers submit a preprint and it gets reviewed by the community, and then there's the option to publish it in the PCI journal. So the stuff that I'm going to talk about is both experiences of doing registered reports generally, but also the experience of having this option of the PCI journal. So as a reminder, that's a diamond open access, so no fees to publish, no fees to read. There are no delays and no costs in publishing in the PCI journal. So what that looks like is once the peer community have reviewed the manuscript or reviewed the preprint, it then almost immediately gets published on the PCI journal website. And there's kind of light touch editing, but there's no of the kind of formatting, typesetting, stuff like that, which means that it is free for everyone to access. It's free for researchers to publish in, and there are no delays and no costs. So I'm going to talk about both of those things. So the very first reason why I like PCI registered reports and just PCI so much. So I'm going to structure this around 4 things that I have heard that irritate me and why I think that this model is a good alternative. Is that, and I don't know whether other people relate to this, but this has happened quite a lot where I write a paper and I submit it to a journal in the traditional form, and editors or reviewers sometimes say that the actual science, the actual research is robust, is clear, is transparent, is all good. It's really, really nice. We love it. However, it's not a good fit for the journal. And I think that this sometimes can be completely legitimate and completely valid if it's a particularly niche journal, if space is short, things like that. But I think one of the concerns and frustrations that I have about this, particularly as someone whose my work now is focusing a lot on improving peer review and trying to think about how peer review can be done differently and making sure that peer review is focusing on the right stuff, that this can also be incredibly frustrating because it becomes less about evaluating the integrity of the actual research and much more about scope and fit. So there is, for example, there's a PhD researcher who I'm supervising, and we are currently on submission number 8 of her first PhD paper, because it is a paper that is inherently interdisciplinary and so sits at kind of fuzzy boundaries between journals. And every journal that we've tried so far has said, we love it, it's brilliant, however, we think it should be in this corner of the discipline rather than that corner of the discipline. And what I like about PCI, and particularly about PCI registered reports, is that that thinking is done later. So it's much more about, is the actual research valid and robust? And then the question of where this fits journal-wise can happen later, or it can be published in the PCI journal in of itself. So I think having this endless wrestle with scope and fit, which sometimes actually is the main thing that's determining the evaluation of the research. I think the PCI approach feels like it's going some way in flipping that it's much more about the actual research rather than about whether it's considered to be a good for one particular journal, which can just waste time. And particularly when we're talking about early career researchers and PhD students, that is a whole chunk of time that a lot of ECRs don't have. So that's my reason number 1. My second thing that I hear, that I'm sure we've all heard and that Chris talked about a little bit, is the endless wrestle with finding reviewers. Now, one of the things so I've had experience of PCI RR as both an author, so I've got did a registered report through PCI, and as a recommender. And I think that one of the things that I've experienced is, I think, because what PCI is trying to do is actually fundamentally rethink how publishing is done and rethink kind of who has the power in how things are published and who has the say. Then I think that what I've found is that because it has this sort of energy of trying to democratize kind of scientific publishing, or I should stop saying science, research publishing, that means that a lot of people I've experienced are quite keen to kind of join and quite keen to be part of this community. So one of the biggest barriers, I think, with publishing in the traditional journal format is sometimes you can have it where reviewers said, I've already reviewed this paper for 2 other journals that researchers are cycling through because of the previous issue around scope. And that means that, again, it's just adding delays that aren't, or that feel like we can do better and that feel like there's different ways of doing this. So I think the idea of kind of centralizing and democratizing peer review, so it's less about having a particular kind of allegiance to a different journal, and so you don't have to cycle through journals if and when a decision is made to then eventually actually get your work evaluated. The idea of it being this kind of collaborative, cumulative, let's bring everyone together and kind of pool our efforts, I have found has also led to a much speedier and also much more constructive and kind peer review process. And part of the reason for that as well, because I'm not sure if we've mentioned it, is that when either PCI registered reports or just PCI generally, when a paper goes through that process, everything is openly available. So the reviews are available and often, typically, signed by the reviewers, and the recommendation is also openly available. And so that means as well that you can track and you can follow the actual process that has happened. And we know that open peer review happens elsewhere. One of the things that's also really, really lovely about PCI is that as a recommender, how it works is that people peer review the work, and then the recommender makes a recommendation, and they write, or we kind of write as recommenders, a kind of full summary of the paper and why it was recommended, and that in of itself gets a DOI number and so can be cited. Because I think one of the barriers as well with peer review generally is that it's relying on free labour, and free labour that's often invisible or hidden. So I think one of the way that PCI works is to trying to make some of that labour visible and citable, which can often mean as well that people feel a little bit more willing to kind of help out with the cause because it's visible and because it's trying to do things a bit differently. The third thing is, and this is something that I feel really, really deeply about recently, is quite a bit of my work now is collaborative with researchers in different countries, particularly in the global south, and the amount of barriers that we have to publishing, financial barriers that we have. If I am not the corresponding author or the first author is staggering. And so having the option of being able to publish, go through the PCI process and publish in the PCI journal, which as a reminder is diamond open access. So it means that we're not waiting for long delays for it to be published. It can be published immediately. It is peer reviewed and it is openly accessible for people to both read and for us to publish, I think has been a game changer in terms of options. I mean, some people have said to me before, well, why don't you just publish a preprint and just put your work as a preprint and it's openly available? And I think that is for sure one option. However, we also know that there is currency in research sitting in some kind of journal and having and have gone through the peer review process. So I think having the option of being in the PCI journal, which is peer reviewed and has been recommended, but still kind of sits outside of the traditional journal format, but is diamond open access, I think has also been game changing, particularly when collaborating with research in the Global South who don't have access to the institutional funds that we do. Next one. This is fun. It's just all my things that I care about. So the thing that I also feel very, very strongly about, and this is about registered reports generally, not necessarily PCI registered reports. So a lot of people make the case for registered reports because it is good for research, so that it combats bias. It means that if you're doing quantitative research, you're less likely to p-hack, you're less likely to hypothesize after your results are known. It keeps people accountable. It reduces kind of cherry picking and all of that stuff. And I think that those kind of reasons for why peer review might want to happen before data are accessed or collected, I think are noble and important. However, one of the things that I also think is important is about acknowledging that way of publishing also has kind of selfish benefits for researchers themselves. So one of the things that endlessly frustrates me as someone who cares about trying to make peer review as slick and efficient and constructive as possible is when I have done a study, then poured my soul and heart into it, and then reviewers say things like, why didn't you just X, Y, and Z design decision that was made 2 years ago that we didn't think about? Or why didn't you ask that question rather than that question? Or why didn't you analyze the data in a fundamentally different way? Or why weren't your participants these people rather than these people? And I think, well, with respect, that's lovely, but that's far, far, far too late. And so one of the biggest benefits that I think, particularly for early career researchers, for engaging with registered reports, is about how it gives you feedback, because I care very deeply about the idea that peer review should be feedback, not gatekeeping. It gives feedback at a time that you can actually do something about it. So I went through the PCI registered reports with a really, really challenging study that was involving lots of different collaborators, and it was longitudinal, and it was with students, and it was tricky data. And that the feedback that we got, and I love registered reports and I try and do them as standard. I think the feedback that we got in that stage one was really beneficial because it was the kinds of stuff that we thought, if we didn't think about that now, then that would have bitten us later. So I think that as well as the idea that it's good for research integrity and it keeps everyone accountable, I also think that there is a benefit for registered reports in that you're just getting feedback at a time that you can use it. And this is also the kind of rebuttal that I have when people say that registered reports aren't relevant for qualitative research, because I am a mixed methods researcher who's really a qualitative researcher. And I think that I've done registered reports for qualitative methods because I think that what it also does is it allows you to do the thinking early as well. So to think about what is the literature and what is the kind of narrative of this study, what are the questions that I want to ask, and what do I think my method's going to be? And if there are deviations from that by the time you've actually done it, that's absolutely fine. That provides a nice opportunity to transparently report that, which I also think could have pedagogical benefits for people as they read it. So that's also why I think registered reports going through this process can be so useful, because you're getting the feedback at a time that you need it. I think that they were all of my main things. My final one, so I was going to talk about how I like that recommendations have a DOI number, and about how that helps us with kind of crediting and acknowledging the labor of researchers. Another thing as well that I didn't realize was a thing until I joined PCR Registered Reports as a recommender is that when I joined PCR Registered Reports, it was the very, very first time, because I sit on a few editorial boards and a few kind of have like action editor stuff at different journals. It was the very first time that I was given proper, very comprehensive, actually, training on how to do that job. So there is training that you go through as a recommender, and you have to do this little test that you have to pass. Felt like my driving theory, that you have to pass in order to do it, where there was a very, very clear sense of, this is what this role is, this is what we are evaluating research on, this is what we're not evaluating research on, these are the values that we have, this is our mission, and this is how we want everyone to kind of be following the same mission. And one of the things that I also care about is about sometimes the misalignment between what journals or publishers or institutions say they care about and what they actually do. And I really liked how there's a quite clear alignment with we're going to put things in place to kind of train and make sure that everyone's talking about the same thing, so you don't have that kind of mission creep that sometimes happens when it comes to journals and publishing. So that was my slightly self-indulgent rant, really, about why I think this approach is useful, but also really, really happy to discuss and take questions, because these are just my experiences, but there's also plenty more that I haven't yet talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maddi. I think that complemented Chris's talk perfectly and gave us a real insight, both from the point of view of you as a researcher, but also what it's like to be part of that community of reviewers, and how PCI really is kind of nurturing that concept of a community of reviewers, and that peer review as feedback, and the openness of that as well. All really, really interesting. So we're now open for questions. So please do feel free to either raise your hand or pop questions in the chat. We do already have a couple of questions. The first one is from Stasia, and it's around the PCI friendly journals, and whether or not there are charges for publishing. So article processing charges, I think those are. For publishing. So I think both of you made reference to the PCI peer community journal, which I think is Diamond, so won't have charges associated with it. But I think there might be more of a variety among the PCI friendly journals. Can I hand over to one of you to maybe?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to answer that. So yes, there's a real range, actually. So we have quite a lot of Diamond open access PCI RR friendly journals, which is great. We always welcome them. They're so aligned in sort of ethos and philosophy with what we're doing that we just love having them on board. We also have some standard open access journals which charge APCs, and to become PCI registered reports friendly, their APC can't be more for a PCI track registered report compared to one that would be submitted directly. It can be the same. Which is interesting, because you might think, well, hang on a second. These publishers claim that peer review is an added value that they provide. Added value. Added value brings connotations to me of, well, if it's an added value that you provide and you're not providing it anymore, if it's being provided to you, then presumably the cost of that added value should be reduced from your APC. And then you raise this with them and they go, oh, no, of course not. No, we want to keep our APC the same. Which means they're actually admitting that the added value of peer review that they provide is zero in cost terms. That's exactly what they judge it as, zero. So this is quite interesting. So what this is, in the early days of these sorts of initiatives, this is fine for us because it creates a competitive market, right? So authors can choose where they go. They don't have to go to a journal with a high APC. They can choose one with a lower APC, or indeed no APC. And in fact, they can choose a subscription journal. One of the fascinating consequences of PCI is a resurgence in subscription journals, because, of course, a recommended preprint is born open access. We never have to talk about open access ever again. So you can go and stick your recommended preprint in a subscription journal for nothing. And it's automatically open access anyway, because it's a recommended preprint. It creates a downward market pressure. So what we've seen a couple of authors do is get their recommended registered report, go to 3 journals and say, can you lower your APC for us, please, because you didn't review it. And on some occasions, the journal has said on a case-by-case basis, yeah, we're going to give you a discount. And as time goes on, we're going to increase the pressure on them to lower their APCs and to offer that discount more systemically. But it's a good question.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And yeah, that's an interesting point, that actually the preprint there exists openly in any case, regardless of which journal it's going to. So the next question that we have in the chat is from Ruth, and she's asking about implications of this type of approach for ref requirements. I don't know if either of you could comment on that.
I don't want to dominate the question time, but I'm happy to take this too, unless you want to, Maddi.
Yeah, Chris, you take this one because I don't know.
Sure. So with the ref, so in the last ref, registered reports were in fact specifically flagged as being indicators of rigor in the output evaluations. So this was in addition to the last ref, and it's going to be bumped up even more in the next one. If you do a registered report, there's a good chance your article will score higher on the rigor criterion, and therefore the output will be scored higher, and therefore you will bring more money to your university as a result. So registered reports off the cuff are a good thing. They're recognized now by REF as being a positive, and there's an advantage in doing them. PCI is that it has no relation to that whatsoever. So PCI just changes the way we do the review process. The REF doesn't care how the review process happens. As long as it's published in a journal, or at least in some form that the REF panel considers to be a legitimate output, then it doesn't really have any implications for the REF. Virtually all of our recommended stage 2 registered reports end up in a journal. Many of them end up in Royal Society Open Science or in Collabra or various other journals that are well regarded. And the peer reviews are all linked within those articles. And so as far as the REF is concerned, there's no particular, they're not really caring too much about PCI, but as for doing registered reports, there is an interest there.
Great, thank you, Chris. And then we have a couple of questions from Emily, one of which you've already responded to in the chat, Maddi, but I don't know if you just want to say a bit about that, and then the follow-up that is around, do reviewers make the choice to be identified in their recommendation, or is that the choice of the authors?
Yes, so the stuff that I've put in the chat, so I posted an example of it was actually the registered report that I did through PCI, and Chris was one of the recommenders, actually. Thank you for that. And so you can see what this looks like, and so you can see the process. So what you will see in that example is you'll see that, like, one of the peer reviewers in the very first round chose to be anonymous, so the reviewers were anonymous. A few of the others, because I think it got reviewed by 4 or 5 different people. Most of the reviewers were named and identifiable, and they signed their reviews and they clicked to say that they were happy to be named. But you will see that there's one reviewer who has opted to be anonymous, and that's just a choice that reviewers have. The recommenders are named because the recommenders they're essentially the action editors. So they're the ones who will write the thing. They're the ones who will collate everything. But reviewers have the option to still be anonymous if they prefer.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add quickly to that, if I may. Authors can choose what's called a signed only track. So for some authors can submit via a track where the reviews must be signed. And so reviewers are invited on condition that they agree to sign. And of course, that can take a little longer because it's a bit harder. It's about, I'd say, if you look at it's about 50-50 in terms of the percentage of reviewers who sign versus don't, if given the choice. But then the signed only track's there. And I think that's also a positive because in certain fields, signing is considered to be quite normal and even mandatory. Like the BMJ, for example, require all their papers to be signed reviews.
Okay, so there's a difference between reviewers and recommenders, and recommenders, yeah, well, there is the difference, but only one of them is obliged to be open. And I guess, yes, that's if you're writing the report as the reviewer, and that's where the citation comes in as well, isn't it? So
yeah, that's right.
Great. Okay, well, we have a question from Jason around how you both became aware of PCI and found your way into it, whether it was through your academic discipline network or whether you were signposted to it, and how are people finding it generally? I think, yeah, Jason is a librarian, and I guess it has a question that I have as well, which is what can we do to encourage engagement with this? So I don't know if Maddi, you want to comment first, and then Chris.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that my way into this was because of that one study that I linked to. So we wanted to run a study where we were, basically, to cut a very long story short, we were interested in whether if students engage in the process of pre-registration, whether in their undergraduate dissertation, whether that has any kind of pedagogical benefit or a better understanding of open science or better statistical literacy later in their dissertation. So as we were designing it, it was there were a few things that were really important. It was really important that peer review happened relatively quickly and that we didn't waste a load of time trying loads of different journals, because it was by design. We needed to get students at the start of their academic year, and then we needed to get them just as they submitted their dissertation. And if we missed the boat at the start of the academic year, the whole study just kind of fell a bit flat and didn't work. So we were kind of scratching our heads trying to think, how can we get around the issue of getting stuck in a peer review process, or that thing that I mentioned in my very first point of journals saying, well, we kind of like it, but not for us. And we were interested in the idea of doing it as a registered report because we knew it was going to be a lot of work and that it was also potentially like relatively risky because we might have dropout, there's lots of different questions that we could ask. I think also part of the reason for that particular study is it was one of these as well that didn't have a natural disciplinary home. So it's kind of sort of psychology, it's kind of meta science, it's sort of pedagogy, it's sort of teaching and learning. And so when I was introduced to PCI registered reports from one of my colleagues and collaborators who was on the paper, who was I think one of the first recommenders, or was certainly like I'd heard about this at a conference or something. I think it felt like a nice place to start at the time. So that was we designed it in 2020 and then went through the first stage one process in 2021. I think PCI registered reports was really quite new then, and so it also was a little bit risky because there wasn't like a huge legacy of loads of papers that had gone through the process, but it felt like a thing to try and remove some of those barriers that we talked about. I think in terms of how to get people to know about it, I think it is just kind of word of mouth and making it about how researchers can actually address some of the issues that they face, because I also think that there's lots and lots of open sciencey stuff about this will make your work very rigorous, which I think is one great sell, but also relies on people fundamentally kind of caring about that stuff. I think trying to make the case that it will make peer review slicker, it will mean that you're getting feedback at a good time. The sort of selfish reasons, I think, can also be the thing that we often don't want to say out loud, which I think can often be the thing that people respond to.
Thank you, Maddi. Thank you. Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just completely agree with what Maddi says about finding selfish reasons. I think for any initiative in open science to succeed, it has to not only work for the community, but for the individuals within the community. And I think one of the flaws in the open science reform movement has been a dominance of initiatives which require the individual to kind of sacrifice themselves for the good of the cause, which doesn't happen. And so those initiatives don't tend to succeed. Registered reports work because, as Maddi has put it so eloquently, they work for the community and for the individual at the same time. I think that's the magic, really, that you get from it. In terms of when I came across PCI, so March 2019, we had a conference in London called What's Next for Registered Reports, where we talked about some of the sort of shortcomings of the format as in the first sort of, 5 to 10 years of it's been around. And I was sitting in the room with Karina Logan, who is quite involved with PCI ecology, which is one of the thematic PCIs, which had just been formed recently. And we all sat there and we just went, we had this penny drop moment. Hang on a second. What if we combine that with this? You know, we could solve an awful lot of problems and regain an awful lot of control and innovate things if we just take the PCI model and apply it to registered reports. It was one of those kind of like, hey, no one's done this yet. And I immediately had a look to see if there was such a thing already, and there wasn't. And so during the lockdowns and the pandemic, I was sitting at home with kids running around writing the policies for PCI registered reports to try and get it to the point where it could be used, as Maddi was one of the early kind of adopters of it.
Right, thank you. That's really interesting. So there, you know, stressing the benefits to individuals of engaging with peer community in, yeah, and kind of, yeah, identifying where those pain points are, I guess, for researchers, and those innovations in open science that actually address those. I think that's a really interesting point. And on the kind of benefits of engaging, Catherine Davis has included in the chat the evidence of engaging in open research initiatives, innovations are also likely to score well in the SPRE part of the REF. So that's another REF reason, I guess, to engage. And Emma's asking if you can share your slides. Maddi?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sure we can, behind the scenes, work out how we do that. And then you very kindly linked to the mission and values for recommenders. Yeah, what are the mission and values of a recommender? And so, yes, those are indeed available. And thank you for providing that link there, Maddi. And then I think we had a question about qualitative research, which I might have skipped over. Yes, going back to Ella, do you have any advice for submitting reports specifically for qualitative research?
Yeah, so I've put a link to a primer for qualitative registered reports, which I think is good. I think it's relatively light in that primer, but I think it is good for giving a bit of an overview. Yeah, so I think some of the pushback that I've had about qualitative registered reports is that people say, well, how can I possibly know what I'm going to do if I don't have my data? And I think that that's particularly true for if you're doing very kind of interpretive qualitative research, or if you're not quite sure what the richness of your data is going to look like, or if you're not quite sure what your analytical process is going to be. I've definitely had it before where because I guess the spectrum of qualitative research, right, from like very, very positivist, we're going to kind of count instances of words, all the way through to the much more kind of like interpretive, reflexive type of qualitative research. I think I've definitely had it where the analytical approach section of the registered report that I've written for a qualitative registered report has kind of been written in a way of, based on our understanding of this topic, based on our plan for the research, based on how we're collecting the data, this is our anticipated analytical plan, and this is what we expect, and this is what we're kind of we're planning for. I mean, I think if you take registered reports as less about holding you kind of to, did you do everything you said you were going to do, to this is more about transparently reporting the process and having peer review at the right time, then I think that also means that it completely makes sense to then say at stage 2, here are the reasons why, like, we thought this, however the data came out like this. And I think the big thing for me with similar to qualitative pre-registration and qualitative registered reports is I think it's just about transparently reporting a process. I think that a lot of the questionable research practices that registered reports were designed to combat aren't that relevant often to a lot of qualitative methods. So I think it is just about reframing it as being less about trying to reduce QRPs and much more about increasing transparency. I think, because I know, just to kind of do a double whammy, I know that there's a question in the chat about current limits or constraints. I will say that I think that there are some constraints with qualitative registered reports in terms of perceptions, and in terms of, so some people have emailed me over the years and said, you know, my registered report was rejected because it's qualitative and there was a misperception about what that was for. So I think that we've got a little bit of work to do about articulating the benefits for qualitative work. But I think the hill that I will die on is that they're relevant for all research. But the primer is a good place to start as well.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left and we've got quite a few questions, but I think perhaps I'll just home in on this one as a final one, and maybe Chris, you could take it. Did any one of you go through setting up a new PCI, and how easy was the process? Because I think that probably does apply to you, Chris, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's fairly straightforward. To set up a new PCI, you first assemble a kind of founding managing board. You put together a proposal and you submit it to the PCI Federation, where it's voted on democratically by all of the members of the other PCIs as to whether it should be established or not. And if the vote is positive, then you can start building it, and they construct the kind of website that branches off, and you can tailor that to your needs.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. And maybe we can squeeze in another one if it's a yes or a no. Are recommenders just from academia? This is from Stasia.
Primarily, they don't actually have to be. In theory, I think it's just because of the fact that most peer review is done by academics, that therefore most peer review from PCI is also done by academics. Recommenders themselves could be from outside academia, indeed, if they met the criteria. So there's certain conditions that have to be met for to qualify as a recommender, in terms of seniority and also awareness and familiarity with open research. But those criteria could indeed be met by someone outside academia. Okay,
well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful, Maddi and Chris, for you taking the time to join us today and sharing so much about peer community that was absolutely fascinating, really informative. Thank you everyone who joined us, and thank you all for your questions and your comments. I think they were all really helpful, and yeah, we had a good discussion there, I think, and really did develop our understanding of PCI and how it can really, really benefit the academic community. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.